Okay, welcome everybody to this special lecture event put on by the chair in Transgender Studies. We're really glad that you could join us here in person and those of you at home or wherever you are on Zoom. My name is Aaron DeVore, and I am the founder of the chair in Transgender Studies and also of the Transgender Archives and the Moving Trans History Forward conferences. So we start at UVic with a territorial acknowledgement. And we acknowledge and with respect the Lekwungen people on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So we are the world's first and still only chair in Transgender Studies. It's a research chair, not the chair of a department. There are no departments of Transgender Studies anywhere in the world yet. We'll get there. Our work is to contribute to the development and the communications of accurate, research-based, real-world knowledge about trans plus people, and we wish to see that used to build better policies, laws, drive social change, and generally make the future better for trans plus people. We help to build strong and resilient social and cultural communities and individual well-being by facilitating arts, cultural, and social activities, some of which you've seen on the video that we just showed. And in all that we do, we are committed to applying an intersectional lens and to advance reconciliation, racial justice, equity, and inclusion for all. So in addition to events like today, we do a lot of other things. And that includes helping to run the world's largest transgender archives and putting on interdisciplinary, international, and intergenerational biennial Moving Trans History Forward conferences. The next one is at the end of March 2025. We also run a variety of scholarships for UVic students and fellowships for visitors and a variety of arts and cultural events. Now I'm going to introduce our speaker. Sarah M. Steele is a PhD, uses the pronouns they, them, and is a postdoctoral scholar working with me on the Trans Plus People in Canadian Prisons project here at UVic. Sarah has a PhD in sociology from the University of Illinois in Chicago, and Sarah's academic work, activism, and research interests lie at the intersection of race, sexuality, trans, and queer politics. And as a recent immigrant from the US, Sarah tells me that they are currently enjoying the short winter and the early flowers blooming already on Vancouver Island. So Sarah's topic is trans and queer sexual politics, the practice of reimagining desire. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Steele.
Just wanted to start by saying thank you to Aaron for the invitation and Michael to coordinate this. As Aaron said, my name is Sarah, and I'm a postdoc here at under the chair in Trans Studies. And today, I'll start a little bit with an overview of my project. So today I'm talking about some work from my dissertation, which pairs critical race studies, social movement theory, and queer theory to examine the experiences, opportunities, and challenges faced by contemporary trans and queer activists taking on issues of state violence and neglect in the city of Chicago. My project centers the voices and experiences of gender minorities and people of color. Today, I will discuss one part of this larger project, which I call Trans and Queer Sexual Politics, the practice of reimagining desire. As the classic, there we go. As the classic feminist slogan goes, the personal is political. This social movement ideology was used to argue that the personal lives of women, in particular, were rooted in larger political structures of inequality, notably patriarchy. It did so by challenging the binary of public and private, arguing that private issues are indeed political issues. Because sex and sexuality have historically been seen as private issues, LGBTQ social movements have built on this ideology by connecting their quote-unquote private peculiarities to political structures of inequality, such as heteronormativity. Notably, queer movement actors of the 1990s, as shown here, took on the same public-private binary through their activism, hosting public kiss-ins and targeting politicians at their homes. In this talk, I examine the inverse of this classic feminist idea, examining the political as personal, or in other words, asking if political ideologies and understandings shape the real-life experiences of sexualities in the social world. I examine the connections that trans and queer activists draw between their political commitments and their private sexual lives. I do so because if, as abolitionist Miriam Kaba suggests, when we set about trying to transform society, we must remember that we ourselves will also need to transform. In this case, political ideologies may shape and even transform the lives of individual activists. I'll begin with a little bit of background to conceptualize this chapter. I'm presenting a subset of data from my interviews, which were developed kind of in line with these three interlocking strands of thought. First is the idea that I discussed that the personal is political, right? This really connects us to various social movement histories and helps us think about the ways in which sexual and gendered experiences are embodied. In that we embody our understandings of ourselves in the world, and our sexual experiences are socially constructed and learned in different ways. Next, I kind of think about this missing discourse on desire. In sociology, they talk about a missing discourse on desire. Most sociological or social science research still ignores desire and pleasure and instead focuses on risk, disease, and dysfunction while also reinforcing heteronormativity. So today I hope to keep, or perhaps bring back, the sex in sexualities, right? And keep those embodied experiences that are important in driving our understandings of the social world. Also, I build on the idea that pleasure is political. Desire and pleasure are created out of, not outside of, larger power relations. Culturally, many structures of desire and erotic hierarchies follow larger structures of white supremacy, hegemonic masculinity, colonialism, heteronormativity, and cisnormativity. These deeply embedded structures privilege white, slim, young, able-bodied, and upper-class heterosexuals within American erotic hierarchies. The third line of thought is this idea of creating livable lives. Much of the research that we see, particularly on trans folks, but also on queer folks, focuses on violence, discrimination, and even death. And I really want to draw in the idea of hope, joy, and euphoria as critical to trans and queer survival. So today I'll draw from a study of queer organizers and activists that I conducted from 2017 to 2020 in Chicago, Illinois, in the United States. This data collection included 3 years of ethnographic participant observation, both within organizations, at protests, at gatherings, things like this, and 38 in-depth interviews with self-identified queer and trans organizers. I offer a small snapshot of some of the demographics here and use the language of social movement organizers, QT BIPOC, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? You can see that 73% of folks who participated in the study identified as queer, 49% as trans, 27% as Black, only 3% as Indigenous, and 76% as people of color. Also, a small note, some folks in the study wanted to use their real names as part of their connection to public activism. Others chose to remain anonymous. And so for those who chose to remain anonymous, I have offered pseudonyms for them. Others, I have used their real names. All the photographs in this presentation were taken by Sarah G., a prominent organizer and photographer in Chicago. She offers a public online collection of her work that can be used with credit. And you can find more of her work at loveandstrugglephotos.com. I will begin my analysis today with a quote from Lasaya, a Black, Indigenous, Puerto Rican, queer trans woman. She says, I think trans and non-conforming bodies are a gateway to new experiences, sexual liberation and political liberation. I do. This talk will explore queer political notions of looking beyond and imagining queer futures as practiced through the sexual and intimate relationships of trans and queer activists. Organizers explain sex as a form and practice of creating relationships or trying to create relationships that don't replicate larger systems of violence. Today, I'll discuss how these political underpinnings shaped concepts of desire and pleasure in the erotic worlds of Chicago's queer and trans organizers. Because culturally available, normative, and hegemonic structures of desire replicate larger systems of domination, Chicago's queer organizers are working to create a politics of desire that reimagines erotic life and denounces erotic injustice. Theoretically, I draw on sexual fields theory, a sociological approach to understanding collective sexuality through the lens of Bordeaux, which has proliferated in the last 20 years. Green, building on Bordeaux, offers us a theory of sexual fields, theorizing erotic worlds as sites of sexual exploitation, and systematic stratification that are both socially constructed and socially constituting. These erotic worlds, then aggregated, are part of a larger field that structures our erotic habitus. Importantly here, a field is a competitive system of social relations, dominated by a set of unspoken structural rules and hierarchies. So Green, and many who have followed along in this social sexual tradition, discuss the erotic field as this competitive system, right? Dominated by unspoken rules, and that the erotic hierarchies are extremely structured by positions outside of sexualities, like race, gender, class, ability, body size, etc. I call these erotic hierarchies and hegemonic structures of desire erotic injustice. And I include in that structures of heteronormativity, white supremacy, settler colonialism, as well as cissexism and binaryism. Using this concept, I focus on the socially constituting potential within our erotic worlds and argue that trans and queer erotic worlds can be sites of resistance. Sexual field theory is indeed a theory of power, understanding that erotic negotiation is a struggle between inequitably empowered individuals. Thus, the politics of desire, desirability, and pleasure are important parts of the social sexual analysis. Queer of color and Black queer feminist scholars and activists alike have taken up these political notions, pushing sexualities in new critical ways towards an examination of pleasure. They suggest that the politics of desire, desirability, and pleasure are important to attune ourselves to. Adrienne Marie Brown, for example, says, feeling good is not frivolous, it's freedom. Munoz also argues that minority subjects are lost without some sense of futurity, a desire that resists mandates to accept that which is not good enough. So together, these suggest that feeling good, tapping into the erotic, or experiencing pleasure are not luxuries, but critical to trans and queer survival. Most sexual fields research to date involves LGBT populations, but only one examines queerness as part of these worlds. The study, which looked at trans men who have sex with men in Toronto, observed kind of peripherally within their data that queer erotic worlds constituted a, quote, disidentification with cisgender gay men. Instead, I argue that queerness is not just a negation or a disidentification with cisgender gay men, but instead, queerness is also its own project. Queer politics shifts desire, what queer sex looks like and what sex can be. This creates erotic worlds of non-normative sexual belonging, both critical of erotic injustice and imaginative in creating new forms of relationality. I'll present my findings today in 3 sections. I'll start with some water. I'll start with a section I call Structures of Queer Political Desire. Desire and desirability represent a field effect where individual desires are transformed into larger structures of desire. This section examines how trans and queer actors both understand and interrogated hegemonic hierarchies of desire and tiers of desirability, as well as how desire was structured within folks' own erotic worlds. For many, the politics of queerness shifted their desire, helping them move away from normative ideas of sex and sexuality. For some, this was related to experiences of being devalued within society. Hierarchies of desirability raise the status of some human characteristics by necessarily devaluing others. As one organizer explains, much of what we think of as desirable and whether or not we think of ourselves as desirable is very political. There's a lot of organizing, especially organizing queer people of color, is working through the fact that a lot of people spent many years thinking of themselves, of ourselves, as less than, or not worthy, or not as good as XYZ, whether that's about race, or color, or body, or desire. These experiences of being devalued or undesirable shape the politics of queer erotic worlds, where organizers unlearn the negative images of themselves and others prominent in mainstream society. For Devi, this includes a critical analysis of desires within structures of racial domination, body size or fat phobia, and heteronormative structures of desire. Talking about how queer politics have shifted their ideas around attraction and desire, other activists say, I think a lot more about who I'm attracted to in terms of race, in terms of body size, that I feel like I wouldn't think too much about if I weren't a part of these circles or identified with these politics. Queer desire is a self-aware rejection of what is seen as acceptably desirable. This critical lens around attraction and desire is actively shifting, both learning and unlearning, the hegemonic structures they are working against and are subjected to. This detachment from expectation opens possibilities within queer erotic worlds that are unavailable or perhaps even unimaginable in the context of normative desire. One activist explains this as looking past hierarchies of cultural value, especially those associated with Blackness. Benji says, I think another way that sex is political for me is learning to see things, learning to desire things, both for myself and in other people that I've been taught are not valuable. Whether it's Blackness and like really desiring or loving or appreciating other people's Blackness and wanting my own Blackness loved and appreciated and desired and treated as sacred. And like sex being a place where that can happen is a really big and really important and like beautiful when that happens. Here, through a queer political praxis, white supremacist aesthetics are or can be rearranged, challenging the historical connections of whiteness to beauty and desirability. Benji is relearning how to value and desire their own and others' Blackness. The beauty of these experiences described by Benji are far from frivolous. Instead, they describe these pleasures as really big and really important, right? This helps illuminate the opening up of possibilities and the potential of queer erotic worlds. Queerness as an imaginative project, expansive in practice. Organizers in the study described what this does or can look like. It looks like embracing and being open to forms of sex and relationships that are not like what our society wants everyone to be doing. So non-monogamy, kink, quote unquote promiscuity, having sex with people who are HIV positive, being transgender, non-conforming, and having sex as a trans or gender non-conforming person. A lot of it is about blurring the boundaries between friends and sex partners and lovers and partners that I don't do a lot of, but I know a lot of people do, and I think it's cool. Queer sex allows for more expansive thinking and more possibilities. Like the way that kink stuff and gear can be really helpful. Harnesses are really great for me to lock my body into a position that I can't hold it into. There's all this crossover between queer, kinky stuff and disabled sex stuff that also feels really very aligned for me. It just makes perfect sense. Here, queerness and queer sex opens up possibilities and encourages engaging in types of sex seen as wrong or bad culturally. And by people, and by people, a disabled person in this example, that are not granted sexual subjectivity in the same way that able-bodied people are. Organizers are committed to moving away from systems of sexual judgment and located that opportunity within queer erotic worlds. Safety and especially consent were also key components of queer erotic worlds, which I'll discuss more a little bit later. But notably, these key concepts for many respondents were related to the experiences of trauma that were experienced by organizers. As one organizer explains, trauma is not unique to some trans and queer folks, but ubiquitous to trans and queer existence in our contemporary world. She explains, queer desire is desire that's grounded in fuller reckoning of the traumas that every queer person, or even like queer and trans person, experiences by danger of occupying those identities for one, and then cognizant of the pleasures that are singular to our existence. You know, the pleasures that come from being in this alien tribe, holding space for both those things within the borders of itself, within the borders of said desire. A desire that is grounded in the unlearning of cis-het toxicities around stuff like consent and fucked up power dynamics and oppression, but that's still free-ranging and weird and wild and kinky and inclusive and fluid and sticky, you know? Saul acknowledges the ever-present trauma faced by trans and queer folks, but also sees it as a special place to unlearn toxic behaviors and experience unique forms of pleasure. Another activist engaged these ideas of trauma and pleasure, thinking about erotic worlds as a space for personal and collective healing. Sammy says, I feel like literally everyone who does organizing around this stuff has experienced some kind of trauma in their life. Whether that's just the trauma of oppression that they had or different traumas of the world, we all come to this very traumatized and are all survivors in different ways. And a way to heal collectively is to prioritize our pleasure, our individual pleasure and our collective pleasure, and make lots of room for that. And then we can do better work together and individually. Unlearning what activists see as toxic relationship structures serve as a form of collective healing available within queer erotic worlds. Pleasure is political and denied to marginalized groups like the people of color, trans and queer organizers in this study. Organizers within the queer erotic world examined here saw desire and pleasure as political and critical to their vision of a better world. While activists recognize and discuss their desires as socially constructed, they are also, through their queer political analysis and praxis, actively constituting the new erotic worlds that they want to find pleasure within. Next, I will talk about queering tiers of desirability. Because queer politics both negate hegemonic structures of desire and desirability and work to imagine collective healing, these politics also influenced with whom queer activists were interested or willing to have sex with. But this influence was complex, messy, and not as simple as just reorganizing a tiered structure. While for all activists, tiers, hierarchies, and oppressive structures are criticized politically, the way that queerness kind of bumped up against, shaped, or created desire differed between people. First, queerness served as a way to vet attraction. As Michelle says, even something as simple as Tinder. I'm very intentional about putting my politics up front because God forbid you're hooking up with someone and they're a Trump supporter or something. For this organizer, the example of a Trump supporter embodies a whole host of oppressive ideologies, including white supremacy, that she was working to kind of self-select away from through her internet profile. This selectivity or vetting played out differently across respondents. Sometimes it became a very strict line where good, quote unquote, good politics were a prerequisite for attraction. As Phyllis says, I feel like the people that I would entertain the thought of dating them or being with them, then I would only entertain that possibility if I were like, oh, you're ideologically, politically a good person, and I admire you for that. I think that's a prerequisite. For other respondents, attraction was not negated by politics as a basis for sexual encounters. Neither was sexual or political identity. But even those organizers held on to certain political bottom lines. As Lee says, I'm a very sexual person. I fuck all kinds of people. I'm not monogamous. Sometimes I'll have anonymous sex, and I don't really care about the person's politics. I don't fuck cops. That's my one rule. That's an A+ rule. Sometimes we just fuck. And then did we end up talking for 5 minutes? Now, do we ever fuck again because I found out you're a super problematic human? Great, bye. Or do we now have this other dynamic? So for these organizers, attraction and sexual encounters could be separated from politics, although never quite completely, as the caveat no cops suggests. Importantly, these queer political influences were not just about limiting options, but about opening them up as well. They created new spaces for attraction not previously acknowledged in the lives of the organizers, notably expanding beyond binary identity construction. As Benji explains, I believed a lot of fucked up things about what I was and wasn't attracted to or able to engage with sexually. And like dating someone who's outside of that binary has helped me realize that like that was bullshit. And I like a lot more things, and I'm attracted to a lot more things and capable of enjoying a lot more things than even the category queer man allowed me to. In this way, we begin to see the connections between attraction and desire and how those change through a queer sexual politic. There's not a simple formula of how trans and queer organizers navigated or experienced this relationship, but almost everyone did. The final theme examined here is queer erotic worlds as a practice ground for political imagining. Here, shifting the power relations that create structures of oppression for non-normative sexual and gender expressions or desire was a critical point of connection for Chicago's queer organizers. Analysis of domination, power, and supremacy are fundamental to their organizing lives. Importantly, this also applied to their personal and erotic lives. As one organizer astutely explained, who we have sex with and then how we treat those people is informed by power. She goes on to discuss monogamy and polyamory and cultures of consent and communication as notable points of power in erotic worlds. She continues, we're trying to practice cultures of consent in queer communities and actually talk about what I really want and need with a partner instead of just blindly fucking. Instead, queer organizers make space in their erotic worlds for communication and consent, sometimes edging towards talk of hyper consent. As Amani states, it's super hyper, almost annoyingly consent informed. Like, you just don't go grabbing people's chests for no reason. Don't fucking do that. I'm going to say, although I don't believe this, it's a not sexy, sexy part of the sex, the things you just don't do without consent. These levels or practices of consent may seem hypervigilant compared to heteronormative or even gay men's sexual scripts. But for queer organizers, not assuming things about each other's bodies and desires was key. Consent has never been equally available to women and people of color in the United States. Instead, African slave women were socially and sexually exploited for their reproductive capacity. Forced and de facto sterilization were also common historical practices among Black and Puerto Rican women and those who were deemed quote unquote sexual perverts. As racial, gender, and sexual minorities, the activists in this study approached consent differently and made it fundamental to their sexual politic. Consent and communication were discussed by most organizers as an important part of their larger queer project. Leah says, I think it means communicating. It means not assuming anything about people's bodies or words or acts or anything. I think queerness is not assuming a way of having sex, actually. Yuki adds, more negotiation, more honesty about what I'm feeling, more room to hear what my sexual partners are feeling. So unlike neoliberal notions of consent, where individuals are held personally responsible for making good versus bad choices and for the outcomes of these choices, regardless of the circumstances, trans and queer organizers had a politically grounded understanding that all social actors are shaped by social and institutional forces that limit or influence their decision-making ability. So instead, they move away from neoliberal discourses of self-sufficiency, self-regulation, and an acceptance of the consequences of one's action, which have been used to shame and blame women of color and sexual minorities. And they move towards a normalizing of honesty, communication, trust, and sharing one's feelings. As Monica also explains, it's consent-based, and it's normalizing having conversations about it and being able to be transparent and open and honest, which is really the basis of what organizing is. It's trust and transparency and communication and being open to experimenting and potential failures, but being accountable, it's like all of the things. For Monica, the fundamental basis of sexual relationships was the same or similar to the basis for good organizing work. The skills developed in organizing work and in queer erotic worlds, those of communication and consent, were useful across spheres. These skills are tied to an analysis of power and trying to shift power relationships. As one organizer explains, as I became involved in radical work, and the more I developed an analysis that was about shifting power relationships, I think that really shifted my understanding of how sex and relationships could operate and made me more attentive to power relations within relationships. To whatever extent I can get rid of my tendencies towards controlling and dominating other people in my sex and relationships, that is what feels important to me. For many organizers, shifting these power relationships was also tied to practices of non-monogamy or critiques of monogamy as a system steeped in ownership. One that queer erotic worlds allow people to reject. As Vida explains, the pent-up toxicity of serial monogamy and waiting for the one and somebody who you're nothing without, who is nothing without you. Queerness changed all that shit for me. And like going from orgasms that make you cry because they're pointless to orgasms that make you cry because they're so beautiful and like powerful, and everything about them makes you feel more you and not like a shell or a shadow of you. This access to pleasure found through queerness is tapping into the power of the erotic that Audre Lorde describes. This type of queer erotic existence allows trans and queer organizers in Chicago to imagine, to long for, and to practice new ways of being in the world through their sexual experiences. One organizer called sex the most intimate level where you practice your politics. She continued, it's like you're just out there and you're saying justice for our people and for our communities. And what that means when you're asking for justice is you're saying something is not right, or what you're doing for these people or these communities is not right, and I want it to look different. To me, if you're out there doing that, and then when you're intimate with someone, if you're not also being like that same mindset of, is this okay? Can I do this thing? How does this feel for you? I feel like it's the same thing. It's just like practicing those larger politics on a more intimate and smaller, deeper level, interpersonal level. Here, she conceptualizes intimate relationships as a practice ground, but also explains how acting any other way would contradict her politics and values. The mindset Monica describes connects to the role of consent in shifting erotic worlds. She wants things to look different in the world, and through her intimate relationships, she can practice those ways, different ways of being. These emotional connections tied to sex as a practice ground engages the politic of hope that is critical for queer survival. Another activist explains, politics definitely influence how we are in relationship with people and how we are creating relationships or trying to create relationships that don't replicate these really terrible systems. Someone being in a relationship with you, but still having the freedom to be their individual self and grow in different directions that you may not be growing in, but that's okay. I think a lot of that is informed by my own politics around the world that I would want, not only in relationships, but also in general. Here, Ariana is imagining a different future and practicing it in real time. This project of futurity, of queer futurity, rejects the here and now as not enough, not settling for current structures of intimacy, relationships, or growth. This potentiality was expressed by many of the organizers in this study. But these organizers also recognized that they didn't always get things right, and that their hopes and their sexual reality, or political reality for that matter, are not always present or practiced, but how they understood and engaged with that disconnection was critically important. As Monica says, it's about experimenting and not seeing those experiences as failures, but just as experiments. I think that's how it plays out in my personal life. But then also in the political realm, it's like, if we don't have the vision and the desires, and if we don't talk about the desires for a better world, or a world where we could be as free as possible, then how are we even organizing? How are we even creating these campaigns and strategies if we can't envision the desires? So in conclusion, these experiences and these connections between desire, sex, and queer and trans community organizing, right? I want to conclude by saying trans and queer community organizers were politically committed to this idea of a concrete possibility for another world. And this really involved the practice of trying to shift power relationships within their own sexual relationships and intimate relationships, as well as a rejection of a plethora of erotic injustices. Of course, organizers were nonetheless structured by the oppressive dynamics that they were fighting and created their own hierarchies of desire. They were structured by existing frameworks, which they are trying to work through in these erotic spaces. This is all part of their larger political struggle as they transform through the work and collective action that they participate in. Okay, thank you so much.
I just want to remind people the Chair in Transgender Studies has lots of programming throughout the year. Stay in touch with us on our social media connections, which you can see up here. We also have a newsletter, there's a place to sign up for it over there if you prefer to get your information through an email. So please help us to continue to do this important work. And contrary to what many people think, this is not an endowed chair, and our survival depends on donations from people like you and from your wealthy friends, and also from the goodwill of the University of Victoria. So if you're able, please use your phone or to scan the QR code or click on the links on the screen and in the chat window. And if you know people who have more money than you do, please tell them about us and ask them to also do the same. So thank you for coming. Thank you to Sarah. Thank you, Michael, Jay, Emmett, and thank you, everybody, for your support of all that we do.